Get a quick thumbs up from all our panelists that we're ready to roll. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us here for a Defense Tech Week panel. Don't hate the game, how dual-use tech startups can navigate the field. My name is Margaret Falzon, and I'm our COO at Squadra Ventures, and we have the great honor and privilege of working with many different startups across the cyber and national security space. We're very excited here to share perspectives from people who are active operators in this field and navigating working across the defense and national security ecosystem, both from the startup, the seller, the buyer, the vendor, all across the different spectrum of the different networks and systems you need to navigate in this space. So today for our panel, we have a little bit of an arc that we want to take you on to get some both really strategic and at sometimes philosophical things out of how to approach these challenges, but also really bring us down to ground us in some really tactical strategies and steps that we can take as we try to work through this as organizations. So we're really going to focus on where do we actually get started? How do we work and understand the network? And what are the things that we need to resource to get to success? And so with that, I'm excited to have each of our panelists introduce themselves and share a little bit about their background and what organization that they're currently working with. And so with that, I'd love to welcome Dr. Carol Lapointe to kick us off.
Great, thanks so much. So my name is Carol Lapointe, and I am currently at Johns Hopkins University. So I'm actually in academia right now at a new institute called the Institute for Assured Autonomy. But I spent over 20 years active duty in the US Navy, first as an operator, and then most of that time as an acquisition professional for the Navy. I work primarily in the autonomy and AI space. And currently our institute at Johns Hopkins, we're very focused on making sure that AI is safe, secure, ethical, reliable. And so we look a lot at dual use technologies, right? We look at it across the national security ecosystem. We also look at other safety critical areas like health and transportation and smart cities. So I'm excited to be part of the conversation today.
Jen Savada, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, good morning, everybody. Or I guess we're actually just good afternoon for East Coasters. Jen Savada, I'm the president of the public sector for a company called Sandbox AQ. We are a spin out of Alphabet, AKA Google, and we are totally independent from them at this point in time, but they did a lot to get us to where we are today. We focus at the nexus between quantum and AI. And it's not as scary as it sounds. It's a lot of things that are here today, but we focused on post-quantum cryptography, so making sure your systems are secure. We look at quantum navigation, so how do you navigate without GPS? Simulation and optimization, how do you simulate quantum computers today without an actual quantum computer? And then we wrap it all with artificial intelligence.
Thanks. Jessica Carroll.
Thank you. So I am Jessica Carroll, and I am the Senior Director for Government Affairs at a cybersecurity company called Shift5. We are a bit unique that we do particularly data and cybersecurity for operational technology, whether it's weapon systems within the department or commercial technologies across our transportation fleets. It's been a really unique transition. I recently left the House Armed Services Committee, and prior to that, I had about 15 years in the Department of Defense doing a multitude of other issues across national security. So joining this panel and being able to be amongst these amazing women is really exciting for me today. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. Brittany Black.
Yeah, hi, good morning or afternoon. My name is Brittany Black, and I lead marketing, business development, and programs for Overwatch Imaging. Overwatch Imaging is a startup. We were founded in Hood River, Oregon in 2016. We're focused on delivering critical intelligence with dual use sensors and customized autonomy and AI software to civil and defense agencies around the world.
Thank you. All right, so to go ahead and dive right in, one of the big things that I want us to really think about today, each of you in your role you're really the innovators, and you have to be the connectors and the explainers to different government and other audiences. One of the things that's very complicated in our industry in some ways is that there's this divide between the tangible and the intangible. Everybody in our space really understands why we need to have a budget for tanks. It's a big thing. We need to acquire it. We need to have them. But it's very complicated to understand. How do you explain and understand the need for something like software? How do you all in your roles bridge that gap between making the intangible tangible for the people that you work with?
I would
I'm
be
happy to-
Oh, go ahead, Brittany.
Oh, okay, I was gonna say, I love this question. So I kind of have two parts to this. Like one, we all know what good service is. We experience that, and that's intangible. We all know software data and efficiencies are driven by technologies. These benefits are also intangible, right? But by no means invisible. So when we go talk to government customers, we can't sell bogus claims. We need tangible data, case studies, customer reviews, everything that can lend credibility to the discussion that we're having. And I also think that it's important to understand that every branch of the government strategic pillar right now is asking them to be data-driven and more efficient. That's how they're measured, not necessarily by touching the product. So by bringing some sort of passion or interest when you're talking about your solution, I think understanding how you can present a tangible source of data to an intangible solution, or whatever the art of the possible may be, right? So.
Yeah, I love that, Brittany. I would like to build on that. I think in addition to what we do individually to talk about our own products and capabilities that we're bringing to the government, is also building a coalition of other organizations, companies, and parts of the industry that are sharing the same passion. You don't have to be in the same line of business, but you may have the same level of things. For example, Rebellion Defense started an initiative on software as a service companies and wrote a letter to Congress saying, hey, we need to look at how we're doing this and how we're acquiring this capability, because SaaS companies don't operate the same as a tank. And what they did is they brought a coalition, I think that's up to like 15 to 20 companies now that are all small businesses that all are in the same boat as Rebellion Defense is. And what we've done is we've said that we're here, we support this, we want to try to find solutions, and we want to build the solutions with you. And I think a lot of times that helps the government when you say, hey, we're not just going to identify the problem, but we're here to build it. And then, that kind of leads to my second point, is to become thought leaders as to how things can change and how things are different, in order to just even identify that those things need to happen, because oftentimes they don't realize that it's an issue until somebody raises the issue and provides something that is a tangible, executable decision and solution.
I think what also helps, and we've seen it actually remarkably over the last couple of days, whether it's an article from Representative Gallagher, former commissioner for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, or today, Mike Brown, outgoing DIU chief, gave a fantastic talk with the Hudson Institute. And the importance of commercial innovation and technology continues to be at the forefront of conversation, whether or not it's discussing kind of the fate of the SBIR program, which I know, particularly for a number of startups, are closely following, including Shift 5. But I think that, to Jen's point in particular, the importance to take advantage of the public discourses that is essentially spearheaded by these thought leaders across the DoD, across Congress, and being able to form that coalition amongst peers, I think is really important message. And it does give a degree of kind of tangible demonstration of what our issues are that we're looking at from various perspectives. And it also shows a willingness to work together and integrate and become interoperable, as opposed to having kind of singular points of capability or effect. And I think that goes a long way of, within a conversation of making sure that we understand how to communicate something that is intangible.
Yeah, and to build on what all the panelists are saying, I think this takes a really multifaceted communication approach, right? You have to have kind of the thought leaders, but you also have to have those on the ground conversations. I know one of my last jobs in the Navy for a few years had stood up a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for unmanned systems, right? And so we weren't even talking about robotic and autonomous systems and autonomy. And I often think it's because it's so much easier to talk about things that you can touch, and how many you have and how big they are and how, deep they go or fast they go. But really, through a lot of kind of concerted communications internally in the organization, Now people are talking more and more about autonomy, and they're talking about AI, and they're talking about the intelligence that really has to drive these systems. But it takes a while to really kind of explain that those intangible factors.
So it sounds like a big part of this for sure is the navigation and getting some amount of education and buy-in from the right stakeholders. It sounds like there's this also this balance between a top-down and a bottoms-up approach. Is there any examples in your work that could kind of help illustrate how that navigation has happened successfully or unsuccessfully for someone?
I'm happy to start on that one too. I think, as Jessica said, the SBIR program is a really good example of that. You can have an SBIR where you have buy-in from the 4-star general or the director of an agency or something like that that gives you a letter of support. But if you don't have the people who are actually going to execute it, the ones that know what the technology is and where it's going to be implemented, also with the buy-in of, hey, I want to work with you. I like your team. I understand your technology and I understand your vision. You're never going to win that contract. You're never going to be able to step foot into the government organization because you don't have support from both sides. And it's a way that it helps to build the advocacy, but it also helps to build and for people to understand your expertise.
So I'm going to jump on that. So Jen, that was perfect. And I truly love this follow-on question because I think, each of us in all of our capacities in some way, shape or form, kind of serve that role as connective tissue, which I realize is a DoD jargon. If there's somebody's keeping a DoD bingo chart out there, I'm probably up to a few already. But as we look at from that bottom up and conversely to what Jen was talking about, you might have a great relationship in communicating the requirement and understanding it at the PM level or even at the PEO level. But if there's not an understanding of how does that translate into services FIDUP, for example, and their budget requests that they're pushing out that's going to be carried by Congress, you're just not going to gain the traction you need to be a long-term effect. And so it almost serves to be both operating at that grassroots level from the bottom up to communicate and understand at the tactical level, and then also at the strategic level from the top down, and making sure you're taking these big vision and ideas of whether it's a DoD decision maker or policy maker, and understanding how they see the world and want the world to evolve, and translating that into requirement support and capability, and figuring out how to talk the language of capability, gap, vulnerability, or deficiency, and how your particular technology can fit within that space. It's a really interesting, I think, role to be in this, in this world as particularly as a startup, where we can almost end up being a translator for various elements within the DoD, federal government, writ large. Or even to the state and local, thinking about the IIJA, for example.
I think it'd be remiss if I didn't tap in here for a second from the VC perspective as well. So this is really on this, this comes back to some marketing concepts, like how do we get noticed? The huge part of what we're trying to do is across all of this is how do we effectively communicate who we are, what we're trying to accomplish, and how do we fit into the mission? One of the things that always stands out at me, I'm sure many of you have probably looked up, what's the right way to do a pitch deck? How do you talk to a venture capitalist when you're looking for funding? I can say time and time again, it rarely happens, but it stands out every time. We have a company that we're in an early stage of talking to. They maybe show us 2 slides just to say, here's what we're going to do. And then they go straight into a demo. The power of actually live showing what the company is building or what they've gotten to so far, even if it's in an early stage, there's no replacement for being able to see, even in a small slice of what the potential of the capability is. So that's from a, sort of your pitch perspective from a startup. But in this space, how do you all see, what are some other examples of what a small startup can really do to get noticed? How do you demonstrate what you're working on when it comes to cybersecurity or AI, when you're particularly in our space standing amongst these giants that have sort of a louder, bigger microphone and a whole lot more of a branding and awareness budget than you all do?
Go ahead, Kara, please.
Oh, well, thanks, Jessica. So one of the things I was going to say is One of the ways it's really effective is the DoD is using more and more different alternative methods in terms of finding small companies and finding talent. And hackathons has actually become a big thing, right? There are incubators, there are other programs, but there have been a number of hackathons, and teams show up and engage in these various hackathons, whether they're in the AI space, the cybersecurity space, other spaces. I know Ensign, which is the National Security Innovation Network, which is run by the DoD, does a lot of these. And I think that's one way that I've seen has been very successful for some small businesses to come and bring a team and really be successful at translating that, because often there's a direct contract as well at the end of those hackathons, even though it's small, but that's a way to start to build that relationship.
I'll jump back in. So I think, one of the unique roles that, particularly as a startup, is understanding how to communicate what makes you different, and not really just by being different or unique, but also how you differentiate the space. And as Mike Brown talked a lot about today, the importance of being a disruptor and looking at national security problems from a completely different viewpoint, I think is really important to communicate in that pitch. And whether or not you're talking to, a DoD official, and Margaret, to your point, the ability, and I think this brings us back to our first question, how do you communicate the intangible? Well, it's a lot easier if you're able to demonstrate in that capacity of what your technology, your product actually does. And that I've seen that, happen with both with advisors and investors, but also with DoD and also with Congress. It goes a long way. For example, if your company is having a live demo or working with the department, and you're able to essentially create a strategy to invite them to that demonstration, you're actually showing how their authorities and appropriations at the congressional level, at that strategic level, are going to create effect within the department from a long-term perspective, whether or not it's on a particular platform or it's on a larger program of record. And I think within that as well, and I know that we've had these great conversations when we've been on the Hill, is also showing how you can work within the existing space amongst those giants, and being a strong supporter, integrating in whether or not, unique capability, but understanding how to communicate that is a support element to where these long-standing larger weapon systems, for an example, stand within the current program.
Didn't your founders, they used to bring they had like a huge giant suitcase with some examples of the hardware setup, and they would wheel that around?
Yep. That is us. We're actually for AUSA this year. So if you're there, come on by. But we'll have we'll show how to hack a weapon system. In this case, we'll bring a machine gun that we can show how we can essentially break into it from a remote capacity. So it's a pretty unique way to do it, but it is, giving it kind of tangible and capability relevance to the department. But yeah, we like to bring around all of our unique tools to also show those skeptics or interested parties and understanding what it looks like when we do onboard onto a weapon system. Let them hold it in their hands, take the mock-ups so they can actually understand. Again, going back to Congress in particular, understand what they're investing in.
So said another way, help and make it cool, right? Help and make us understandable and cool. Brittany, do you want to comment on this too? I know you all have cool hardware that you're bringing around as well.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the first couple of questions, right? So you need adoption from every level in an organization. And adoption, you need to keep adoption. So one, knowing your audience, knowing your market, knowing your product. You need to spend the time and money to build a thorough marketing communications plan. So that includes understanding what's the best way to present your product to the specific audience. And so I think really spending the time to know your audience, your messaging, what you're offering, what do you need to bring, what's your call to action, understanding that AUSA is the type, like Jessica said, like that's the event to bring this to. That's what your users want to know, versus on a website, you might do something different. Our demo is important. So spending the time beforehand when you're starting to go research the customer to understand how you're going to pitch or showcase your product, services, your technology is really important to be able to move quickly and adapt as needed, where you're making successes or not.
Great. So tying in, so really as we tie this to where I'm trying to move us to next. So a lot of this communication is really in the informing, increasing understanding. The next phase is really moving beyond that into influencing, whether that's through winning an SBIR or getting those early adopters. And I see that we have a question from from Russell in our chat that is similarly about how do you help get those early adopters and advocates at the lower level. And so with that, I know this sounds very broad, but how do you win the networking? How do you pull that off? Or how have you all pulled that off?
So I'll jump in here super quick and then hand it over to Brittany because I know she's going to have a unique perspective of this probably from the different angles, but same side. I think going back to, first of all, a couple things. I think of influence, if we talk about it in the way that that particular word of how do you create broader brand awareness. Marketing is a huge component of that, but it is ends up, if we think about government affairs or government relations as a function itself, and that really ends up being kind of a whole of company corporate function, because so many aspects of the kind of company's existence end up having to be part of that influence campaign. And I feel as a former DoDer, it's hard to use that phrase influence campaign because it seems like it's a little bit mischievous perhaps, but the intention is really how do you build brand awareness across, a broad swath of potential customers or, academia or other industry peers who don't have a good understanding about kind of what your technology does. And kind of, one of the earlier points that we brought up was the importance of being that connective tissue between, the grassroots and the strategic, and being able to tie interested parties together that might be talking about the same problem set, but in different ways is really important. Go ahead, Brittany.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I love this, everything what Jessica said, but also like you just have to make friends. And the first move is always the hardest, right? So I think that you need to be authentically curious. You need to really be interested in the market and the problems and make sure that you don't have a personal bias, but know your market, know your customers, know alternative solutions and competitors to protect your credibility when you're having those discussions. But not every phone call, not every network, not every influence you have is going to be like a sale. It's going to be like you're actually looking to further, like to better understand what's out there. What is the problem set? What can you do to make it better? And I think that if you just take one thing away from how to influence, it's just to make friends and make a bigger network. And then to call on those friends to ask for help or to make connections. And just from doing that, you can tie in a different people like relations, or, to Jessica's point, you can bring in different people who can influence in certain ways, but you need to understand like where to position yourself or your product or your company. And you do that by having a large network and just making the first phone call or the first email, whatever it may be.
I think that actually Brittany's point about kind of the difference between not everything is going to be a sale is also a really unique component to that, because you have to understand that while it might not turn out in, from a pipeline perspective, you're creating strategic awareness, and that goes a much longer way as opposed to thinking about kind of your problem set, your capability, or your ability to make friends in a very tactical sense. There has to be kind of a kind of a twofold approach to understanding where you are in the here and now, and how do you meet those quotas for each quarter, but also what are you creating as from a long-term awareness and essentially capability adoption. And that goes to some of those much larger and probably more influential friends that Brittany is referencing.
To spin this a little bit, Jen and Kara, thinking back to your previous roles and even in your current roles now, what are some of the things that maybe, I don't like to say mistakes, but things that went sideways, or things that you've seen people do that just didn't work and felt in the opposite of trying to making friends, right? That had the ick factor.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think one of the things that's challenging, we talked about before, is that when you're working in the digital space, a lot of this is intangible, right? And people don't necessarily understand the technologies, these rapidly emerging technologies. And I think one of the things that is not successful goes back to something that Brittany said earlier, is you have to actually be explaining the technology in ways that are accurate. And you have to be really forthright in terms of what your capabilities are, what you're really trying to do. I know, I've talked to a number of companies that say they're doing AI, and then you kind of dig into it and really understanding what they're actually doing, whether it's data science, whether it's machine learning and things like that. And I think the way to build relationships based on trust is to be really forthright about what your product is, what you're doing, what's innovative about what you're doing, and do it in a way that's educating as opposed to kind of playing buzzword bingo in terms of selling your product.
Excuse me, I'll add on to that and say that there's a couple other things that don't work very well. One is to do a cold call, and as Brittany said, like just start off selling. You actually need to know who you're talking to and what role they have and what influence and capability they have. If you talk to someone who has no budgetary control over anything, asking them to buy your product is not the best ask. It should be, who can I talk to that might understand this a little bit better or have the ability to influence, is a better question. The other thing is not knowing the understanding or the knowledge level of the person you're talking to. So go out, look at YouTube videos, read articles, see what else they're producing on places like LinkedIn, and see who they are and what they deal with and how they communicate, because you want to have and meet them at their level. You don't want to come in at a very technical level if they're not, and you don't want to come in at an under, a very basic level if they're more technical. And then the other thing is if you're just selling to sell but don't understand what excuse me, what the goals, the budget or other things are for that organization, it also isn't effective. So knowing that what they had in the NDAA, for example, knowing what programs they're a part of, knowing what contracts their organization take part in is extremely important, because oftentimes I would ask, well, how can you get to me? And they'd say, oh, I have no idea. So why is that my job to do research on how I can, acquire your stuff? You should be able to tell me if you care enough about my organization and what I do to know how to reach me.
I just want to say, I want to follow up one thing with Jen. I know we said this for the marketing piece and also for this last discussion, but researching, knowing your market, knowing your customer, knowing who you're talking to, the more you know is really better, I think, in any of these scenarios. So it's a lot of work to do it beforehand, but to have an effective, to make sure that you're sending the right message, or that if you only get one phone call, you have to be prepared. And I think that's what I see a lot of in, new people trying to come into the market and sell something, is that there's no research involved. They think they can just make a phone call, but you have one chance to maintain credibility or to give a first impression of you or your product. And if you aren't prepared for that first phone call or that first meeting, or potentially someone you might meet in the elevator at a trade show, then you've basically set yourself up to potentially, have to spend years trying to get back to the position that you just lost. So doing the research ahead of time with like a very thorough, whether it's a communication plan, whether it's a strategic plan, whether it's a capture plan, whatever you want to call it, whatever it is, just put it on paper, do the research, know who you're talking to, and stick it down there and like talk about it and make it a living document that continuously gets updated. I think that's a key takeaway for all of this.
I would also add that I think that a lot of times people don't know themselves or their product well enough to be concise. And so oftentimes as a senior leader, it's the first 5 minutes of a conversation that make or break whether or not you're going to have more of a conversation or follow-on conversation, because somebody can get really busy super fast and have another call or a meeting they have to go to. And then also, once you do that elevator pitch, to ask questions about their pain points, their needs, their budget, and their timelines. Because if you can't meet those, or if you don't understand them, or if you just want to know and hear it for themselves, it actually builds rapport.
Yeah, I love the core of this. I know sometimes we probably look back and you're like, imagine doing a research paper as a kid. You're like, when am I ever going to use this? In sales, in a startup, you use this every single day. It doesn't matter whether you're meeting with a potential buyer or you're talking to a VC. We live in a world where if there's a calendar invite, you have the capability to find out information about every single person that's going to be on that call. So you won't believe, even, when we're meeting with companies as well, they haven't done the research on who's going to be in the room. So they don't know their audience. So they don't know how technical to start or not. And it's just like, we have such a luxury. If we take advantage of doing the research, it can completely change the trajectory of those conversations. A slightly different tack on this, because the one thing that I think is always important to keep in mind, we want to get this information from people once we've shifted over to when we've gotten the call or we've gotten the meeting or talking to them. But we don't want to dig in and make it sound like an interview where we're just getting stuff from them. It's still we're still in that relationship building phase. So one of the things that when we're evaluating startups for investment, the business model is obviously a huge piece of the bet that we're making as VCs. And when you're interacting with funders that understand already dual use companies, that's an advantage. But sometimes you're still talking to people who are looking to figure out how to model the company from a more traditional SaaS license revenue. But within the dual use space, we're also trying to not only understand what the defense and national security opportunity is, but what's the potential for future commercial as well, whether or not that's part of your strategy today, but could it get there in the future? So with that discussion, it doesn't matter if you're a small startup or are a big company. A lot of it comes down to how do you and when do you have that conversation about pricing from a selling side, and then also from the buyer acquisition side. So in your experiences, how have you gone about approaching pricing and having that conversation?
I can start that one. So
Thanks, Brittany. This is a hard one, but I know many people, everyone in our audience here has wrestled with this. So we're going to give our opinions and what we've done.
Yeah, this is hard too, because I came from a larger like defense contractor, right? So I think it really depends on your solution and the market you're going into and the agency, right? So it's a little, and this really is if we think of like civil, commercial, and then into the defense space. So are we disrupting a market? Is there a current program of record? Is the current solution commoditized? Is it already LPTA, right? Is the customer price sensitive? Is this replacing a current service? Like, is there, what do we know? Again, going back to research, right? What do we know about the entire program? So I'll use my example, I'll use some of our sensors as an example here. When we think of putting one sensor on an aircraft in a civilian or in a commercial setting, it's quite different than talking about a fleet in defense, right? Because that is a major undertaking when you think about maintenance that has to happen, or just bringing a deployed aircraft back home to get something done to it, or wherever that may be, right? So understanding what if somebody does sign something for a piece of technology, does it have to be installed on a platform? Understanding what the sales cycle looks like and what the programmatic cycle looks like after a sale, I think is really important to understand what's the total cost to the customer and understanding where you fit in there. And the other piece is like, if you're thinking about scale, like, is it repeatable? So as you're trying to go to market, as you have some sort of price to win strategy, right? Whether that's for a single product through a SBIR, maybe that's some sort of formal acquisition or program of record, like really understanding, is the price that you're doing repeatable at the scale that you think you're going to grow to? Meaning, you know, and I think that is having some sort of long-term vision of understanding where your price point sets with the future, where it could potentially go in the market, right? Once you throw out a price, it's really hard to kind of navigate around that. So you need to be thoughtful and thorough in being able to justify that and understanding where it fits with current solutions or your competitors. That's the approach that we take here at Overwatch.
I think one of the challenges with pricing, especially in the government space, is that the government often acquires platforms or products as services. And you have to understand, how do you translate what your product's capability looks like into a service offering in order to be able to compete both at the product level and at the service level? Because oftentimes the government will come and they'll say, I need something that looks something like this. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's my product. But they're asking for labor hours and they're asking for other things that are not normally like a licensed product. And so from there, in addition to what Brittany's talking about, you also need to understand how the government acquires things. And it goes back to sort of like the software as a service, the platform as a service and some of the other ways that the government is coming after more emerging technology until they figure out how to do it from a more commercial related acquisition strategy.
So I think on a slightly different take, Kara, as you're sitting on the acquirer buyer side, how do you actually approach the negotiation with a smaller company? Like what goes into it? What are you going into that discussion with?
Yeah, so I'll say, you have to think about it a little bit differently from the government side, because really it matters what the mechanism is, because there's so many different mechanisms by which the government does acquisitions, right? So there are kind of more traditional requests for proposals where you'll have a formal source selection board, right? You have these other transactional authority mechanisms. So like DIU, right? They have their commercial solutions opportunity contract, which is another transactional authority, which allows you to do kind of prototypes and different things like that. So they'll have a different process. There are all these different consortia where they have a very different process than kind of an RFP and a source selection board. So it's really not so much about that kind of the government is negotiating often as it's putting out a call for a proposal. So that pricing is really the burden of that is put on the company. And some of the things to think about are what the government is generally looking for is best value, right? The best value for the solution that they're going to end up getting, right? And I wouldn't even necessarily think about it as instead of acquiring products, we're acquiring services. It's often that you want a whole solution to whatever problem, right? So that it can include the service piece and the product piece. But I think that it's so dependent on which mechanism you're using.
Which goes back to knowing your audience, who you're interacting with, doing the research, understanding what they've acquired in the past. That's a big piece of it as well then, too.
Also, just to jump in, I think what's a unique look at this as well is understanding from your audience, knowing who you're trying to sell to is the difference for, and I'll pick a couple examples. U.S. Special Operations Command is going to have a very different requirement in how they want to adopt technology than the United States Army as a service, and how they look at programs and how they look at their strategic vision and goals and how they want to modernize as a service. SOCOM, as an example, is going to have the ability, and they have different authorities that allow them to be very agile and very innovative, but they can adopt technologies and pick pieces of it and components and ask for and result in interoperability. And so I think what's a really unique point, especially from Shift 5, is understanding how we've kind of gone between big services and U.S. Special Operations Command, and the evolution as we look towards those particular customers and understanding how we meet their needs. And that goes back to what Jen says too, is understanding who's in the room and what are their needs, not just in the very tactical sense, but in what problem they're trying to solve today, but really what are they saying with their budgets, with their guiding documents, within their broader profession of what they're trying to solve for tomorrow. And that I think also drives, and I can't speak to it, with my particular role as far as pricing, but it helps you understand how you need to be adaptive and essentially very innovative and agile with even how you're selling yourself as a company to meet those very tactile but also strategic needs and requirements based on your audience changing. They're just, they're going to have very unique requirements in the end of things and how they can actually maneuver in that space.
Yeah, and if I can
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to build on a little bit of what Jessica said as well, which I think is really important, how she's pointing out there's different types of organizations, right? SOCOM operates very differently as the services. Things like the Missile Defense Agency are going to operate very differently. And part of it is because we have on the government side, when I was on the government side, there are different parts of the organization. So you have what are called your resource sponsors, which are often the offices in the Pentagon that have the money that they're going to pay, right? But then you have your acquisition chain of command. So you have your program offices and your PEOs or your program executive offices that are doing the acquisition process, but you also have technical authority. So you have an independent technical authority that's verifying that these things meet the need, right, from a technical perspective. And so in organizations where there's bigger organizations, it can be more complex to kind of walk through different types of acquisition processes when you have all those different pieces. Whereas something like SOCOM, they actually physically in the same place locate all those different pieces in the same place. And that makes a big difference in terms of understanding the speed that you can do things at, right? And the processes. And I know we haven't talked about speed, but speed is a really big thing because especially for a small company, you may not have the runtime to wait a really long time for contracts to go through and get fully executed. And so understanding not just what your customer needs and their problems, but also their ability and their kind of timeline about how fast they can execute and making sure that's appropriate for your own business model is really important.
And also just on that, sorry, Margaret, I love Carol's points. And I look at Special Operations Command as a really unique test bed because a lot of what happens from an innovative technology and capability perspective ends up being kind of translated into broader service requirements and needs as well. And so when things are tested and fielded in an organization like U.S. Special Operations Command, it goes a long way to also give you the bona fides and verification that you need in those conversations as you look to broader service. And another point we haven't really touched on too is in this broad conversation about the government, there are also going to be unique needs and requirements and how you talk about your capability fitting into whether it's a Title 10 or a Title 50 issue as well. And so understanding, again, going back to our conversation about, your audience and who you're trying to engage with is very important. But I think, looking for those organizations where you can move that faster if you are a smaller step, like a U.S. Special Operations Command opportunity, that gives you a lot of kind of leeway to demonstrate and test something early on and figure out how to build those pathways to broader service.
So two really tactical questions to dive in for a second that have come from our audience. So one, there's part of this is who are the actual, so given that, and I know that with other programs, whether it's SOCOM or AFWERX or some of these other programs that are helping be faster pathways to innovation into the system, what are some of those actual titles or orgs that you would target to help with adoption of newly commercialized products, whether that's from an SBIR or not? And sort of the flip side of that question to me is, what are those places that in the space that are the most open to changing embedded culture, where their cultures in those organizations are already evolving to be more open to working with innovative and new technologies? Or is the hack that there is no hack and it's all different? Everyone has different structural organizational naming systems.
Yeah, so I'll take the second part of that question first. From the how do you work with organizations to try to bring in emerging technology when they have their culture already set? In every organization, there are always innovators or rule breakers or, boundary pushers. And sometimes you just need to find those folks to have a conversation with to see what are the things that they are trying to do, where are they running into roadblocks, and how you can help. And oftentimes they're looking for the company that has a unique solution that they just didn't know existed. And it helps them with what they're trying to accomplish. On the flip side of that, there are also those that want to still do, everybody wants to be frugal with the government's money and they want to be good stewards of the government's money. And if you can come in and create a case that shows how you're saving them time, money, resources, and that it can be reallocated to something else, that's another win-win. And it might be something that's countercultural at the moment, but when you show it how it does fit into the culture and helps to support what they're doing, they're more willing to listen and have a conversation.
And to build on what Jen's saying about there's always innovators. So, in most PEOs, which are for the DoD, a lot of the acquisition happens through these program executive offices and the programs that fall under them. Generally, there are S&T directors in those PEOs. And so there are people that their job is to understand kind of the S&T and how the S&T could be pulled in ultimately to more, production line acquisition. And there's this idea of push and pull, right? S&T creates things and it has to be pushed. But pushing often isn't enough. Then, the program offices have to also do pull. They have to pull things across what we sometimes call the valley of death, right? And so S&T directors, that's really their role, to understand S&T. They'll often be managers of kind of the SBIR process. And then they help match up who are those transition offices that are ultimately going to pull those innovative solutions into more production level programs.
So all of this to say is that it takes time, resources, people, energy, effort to figure out how to navigate this. So when we're thinking about that, how do we really, so two sides of it, a little bit inspired by one of our audience questions as well, is what is it that people, whether it's the vendors, the startups, the buyers, anyone from your perspective, what do people underestimate the importance of? What should they be resourcing that they're not? Oh, gotta love these hard questions at the end here, Cam. Love hearing the silence everyone's thinking.
I don't like silence, so I'll just start the conversation. I would say there's a question too that we have in here about, like, making friends, like, how do you do this? So my answer to this is always technology and tools. As a startup, your resources are tight, right? Whether you're talking about, financial constraints, or you're talking about just people, like bringing people on board, that takes time to onboard a person, the right person. So you need to make sure that one, you are talking to the right person, which goes back to kind of like the theme of knowing who you're talking to, making sure that if you have 2 hours in a day to make phone calls or to talk to people or to make friends, that you're talking to the right people that are going to move your business forward. At the same time, you kind of have, to Kara's point earlier, you have two paths most of the time, I think, in a startup, or at least in my experience, is that you're running one path, which is you have to generate revenue. You're trying to transition into this space that's defense, which typically has longer sales cycles. So you have to be able to kind of split your mind and your tasks and your resources to be able to, one, action revenue right now, which is very like inside sales, action oriented, selling something tomorrow potentially, or getting a SBIR, whatever that may be. And at the same time, you still have to be working these larger term programs, which are 2, 3, 5 years out. So to do that, you need to be able to get the most out of your time. So the technology and tools out there for marketing automation, sales automation, however you can, to make 10 of the right person to do simple tasks, I think are helpful in that workflow. It's also important that you spend the time and efforts to create a strong foundation that allow the organization to adapt. So as you bring on more people, as you're expanding, as you're growing quickly, whatever that may be, spending the time initially when you think you don't have it to create a foundation, whether that's processes, whether that's the tools, technology, whatever that may be, to set it up right, will save you effort in the future, and also make sure that as you onboard new people or as you scale resources, whatever those may be, that you're scaling them in a way that's setting them up for success, which then again sets the organization up for success.
And to plug a really fine point on that with Brittany, I know that she hears this from me frequently, but I'm all about encouraging companies to set those foundational things, that yes, it is easier to make an Excel sheet that you can track stuff in to start, but there's never too early to invest in an actual CRM, because those notes from an event where you met someone that's now in that program office that you actually need to talk to, but you met them 2 years ago, if you don't start collecting that data about your company's network at the very beginning, you're missing opportunities. So CRM, HubSpot, Salesforce, whatever it is, get it in a real system. I can't hound people on that enough. Jen.
Yeah, so the thing I would also add is that no plan survives first contact, as we know, being government people. So oftentimes when you go into a startup, I'm in my second startup in 3 years, and we had these headcount plans, like who are we going to hire? What skill sets did they need? Where do they need to come from? And after you make your first couple of hires, I always recommend pause for a moment, reflect, and see what your true gaps are and where you are, because as time evolves, your needs change. So you might not have needed that contracting officer, but now all of a sudden you've got all this demand and you need somebody who understands IP and how to negotiate with the government. Or maybe you need to be more involved with advocating to the Hill and talking from a marketing perspective. So maybe you need a government affairs rep instead, and you didn't think you needed those. And I've done a lot of discussions, and I also recommend people who are in startups to talk to other people in startups and ask a question like, what are the 2 hires that you wish you would have made sooner? And see what they say. Oftentimes it's like, oh, I wish I would have hired a contracting person, or I wish I would have hired a government affairs person, not I wish I would have hired 5 more BD people. And it's a different perspective, because when we come in, we're thinking sales, 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 we got to make it. We're gonna bring this awesome technology. But in reality, to create an organization that's well-rounded, that's effective, might be different.
So just to build a little bit on Jen's point as well, I think one of the early, and this goes to what I think I'm looking at as a question from the audience as well, is like, where do you invest when you look for opportunities to expand, your capability, your brand awareness, create that strategic influence? And kind of to Margaret's point about creating that, CRM, so you understand what your network is, but she mentioned, it all started with an event, and how do you create that, that experience, that event into something more tangible? And it's, worth the investment to look at external organizations, whether they're trade associations, or if there are groups that are focused on a particular capability that centers around, your technology, that you could end up growing into a thought leadership role. Those are worth the investment, because they end up being both kind of a networking conduit and allow you to connect with, interact with, and build brand awareness with other like-minded peers or people who are looking for a particular capability to fulfill a gap. But they end up being kind of force multipliers for you, as particularly as a startup, when you are lean and you are new, looking for organizations that can essentially be that echo chamber for you and put you in positions to build that thought leadership space is really, really important and really worth the money. And there are a few that that Shift 5 is a part of that end up being, really great associations for us. One is Global Special Operations Foundation, that we're Forces Foundation that we're in right now. But the way that they provide the networking connectivity for us as a small startup is really important. And so some end up having a bit of a, higher buy-in, but that cost over time as you build and create those foundations through those networks ends up paying dividends, because it does. And it looks like Russ's question, it ends up tying you back to those people that you might have not understood how to connect with to begin with. And so it does illuminate other pathways, whether it's into the DoD or to Congress, that might have not been there to begin with.
This is like an interesting point on this too. Oh, sorry, Jen. I was like,
one more thing.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is don't forget to use contractors as well as consultants, especially for short-term things that you might not need somebody over the long haul. If you're writing a proposal and you need somebody to come in and help, hire that person to come for the 20 hours that you need them to do it, and then don't worry about the rest of the time when you're not writing a proposal. Use your money wisely and realize that it's not always about headcount that are W-2s. They could be fixed term W-2s, or they could be a consultant.
Yeah, that was on. I love that point too, because that my flip side of this question also is like, as startups, we're always watching every dollar. We're trying to make sure that we're resourcing the right things. What are the things, if you could name just a couple things that you feel like you can get away with without paying for, and something that you need to start paying for now?
So I'm a true believer in LinkedIn. As a company, having a LinkedIn page and having a LinkedIn page that's built out, it does a couple things. One, when people, especially in the DC area, are looking for a company, they go to LinkedIn and then they go to the website. So make sure that both of those are there. And then if you have a company LinkedIn page, you can take all of your personal connections, and many of us have thousands of connections, and you can invite them to your company page. So it helps to build your profile. It helps to build who you are. You don't need to go all out and get the $40,000 LinkedIn version. You can actually do a very small version, and for small business.
Yeah, I second LinkedIn. I think that depending on where you are, you need a CRM. So HubSpot, you can start as free. As you build your business, you can obviously get more of the, there's different, versions you can get that are pay or some sort of software as a service component of it. But if you need to start something for free, like go to HubSpot, go to LinkedIn. And I would say if once you know your message, like, advertising is very powerful if you do it through the appropriate channel. So if you understand who your audience is, investing even a couple $100s to generate awareness for your company in the right location with the right message is worth it. So if you're going to do something in advertising, I think it's crucial for awareness, to generate awareness on a large scale. And so if you're going to do it, though, you need to make sure that you're doing it appropriately and make sure that you're sending the right message to the right person so that there's value and that you're tracking that. So CRM, 100% from a sales background. You also need some sort of programmatic tool to make sure that you're doing feedback loop and follow up so that you can have continued adoption, or like your customers will maintain your program throughout the life cycle. So whether that's Smartsheet or some other tool, there's free or paid services, but you need something that manages the entire customer life cycle, including before they even know you.
And
So I
Jen,
know we're coming. Go on.
really quickly, just Jen was talking about, that wonderful question of, if there are 2 hires that you wish you'd had, but you didn't do right away. And not to shamelessly plug government affairs, but whether or not you're at the point of your journey as a startup where you can do it internally. And if you can't, then to Jen's point, also looking externally for those consultants or advisors that can help you understand how to not just get to a phase 1, but then look for a phase 2 SBIR and what makes sense for your company, and understand how you can translate, somebody that can help you translate what you offer and how you support broader national security objectives and goals into that government speak is really important. So I think, all startups should, become early adopters of government affairs, simply because as a function, it does end up meeting so many kind of other corporate support elements within your company. But also, if you can't do that, then understanding how to take advantage of those advisors, especially in the DC area, that do understand how to be your advocates if you can't have somebody internally.
Yes, we are always starting, every company that we work with, they begin a relationship with a lobbyist of some kind, because it's never too early to start those relationships. And so I know we're coming up on time. I love this, and I know that we could talk for longer, but just to close us out, if we wanted to just one word of advice or tangible next step for our audience to take away from their time with us today. And we'll go in reverse order from our start. Brittany, you're first.
Research. Be overly curious about everything. Customer, competitor, market, contracting vehicles, whatever it may be. Just research, research, research.
Jen?
I'd say stay the course. You're going to have ups and downs. It's a startup. Realize that this blood, sweat, and tears you put into it is all rewarded in the end. And making an impact for our government or national security is worth it.
Kara?
Say be authentic. I agree with Jen that really, the mission-oriented piece of ultimately this is really to provide for the national security. I think if you're authentic and you build relationships that way, then people will see the value in that.
Jessica?
I think taking your tangible goals that you have today and also trying to translate them from 5 years out, what that'll allow you to do is actually walk that back and put concrete objectives and milestones in for your company to start building towards. And so it seems almost crazy to think about, particularly as a new startup, what you might look like in 5 years, but be audacious, kind of to to Kara's point about being authentic. Also be audacious, figure out where you want to be in 5 years and start building your plan to get there.
And I love, you couldn't have teed me up better. I love to always remind people that regardless of where you are in this journey, people, whether it's hiring teammates, whether it's working with new customers or working with VCs, the thing that we're all looking for and what we really want to see happen is we want to invest in the plan. We want to understand what the plan is. It's not about the technology. It's about what we're going to achieve and how we're going to get there. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us today. Look forward to staying in touch, and happy Defense Tech Week. Thanks very much, everyone.